watching India Today Global with me, Ishita Mitra. And the big question we're asking today is, how will the Israel-Hamas war get impacted after the pager explosions that rocked Lebanon yesterday? If we look at the developments, what happened in Lebanon was a scene straight out of an action thriller. Hundreds of pagers blew up across the country at the same time, and this killed about 11 people while injuring over 2,700. This attack primarily targeted members of Hezbollah, which is an Iranian-backed militant group, and now the group has vowed retaliation, blaming Israel for the attack. While, of course, Israel is yet to say anything, and I don't think any statement is likely to come from that side. But you see, timing is key here. The attack came just after Israel extended its war goals to include its northern border with Lebanon. And you see, this border has been volatile since the Israel-Hamas war started. IDF and Hezbollah members have been exchanging fire, and the conflict has been going on since October 7, and now all the more likely to escalate. So there are many questions here. If Israel did carry out this attack, how was it able to do so? Was the Taiwan company involved in the attack? And of course, how will this impact the ongoing negotiations? So to unwrap all of this, we have with us Andrew Fox. He's a retired British paratrooper and a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. He's also a defense expert, somebody who's been, closely following the situation in West Asia. So thank you, Andrew, for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
First thing first, could you help us understand what exactly happened yesterday in Lebanon? Because this was not just any usual attack. We saw people blowing up across the country at the same time. So what was it?
Well, Hezbollah have been using pagers for months now because they believed that mobile phones were too vulnerable and too easy to intercept and hack by the Israelis. So they've reverted to using pagers, which of course is 1980s technology. At some point in their most recent delivery of pagers, Israel have managed to intercept that shipment and have managed to sabotage those pagers, most likely with some form of explosive, because the bangs we saw on the videos from Lebanon are probably far too big for just batteries exploding on their own. There has to be something else in there that's created a bang that size. At some point yesterday, Israel activated all of those pagers, and they've caused significant damage to nearly 3,000 Hezbollah operatives.
And the role of Israel. So how do you think it was able to carry out an attack on this case? Because what was the modus operandi used in this? Did they hack the system, or was there human intervention involved?
So I think definitely the Iranian and Hezbollah networks have been penetrated by Israeli intelligence. That's obviously something that's happened here, and information has been given to Israel. Now, it could be one of two things. It could be as simple as knowing the numbers and the IMEI codes for those pages, so they could send them a message that's caused the booby trap to detonate. Or it could be much more complicated than that, and they've actually hacked the code of the pages, and they've conducted a cyber attack to hack the very hardware of the pages themselves. Now, we'll never know the real answer to that. I don't think that will ever reach the public domain. But the key point here is that Hezbollah are completely compromised now. They know that Israel can reach out and not only just kill their commanders, as they have been doing for the last 11 months, but also the ordinary Hezbollah foot soldiers are now at risk from the compromise that Israel have achieved. And that's a very, very powerful psychological blow against Hezbollah, as well, of course, as being a very painful and damaging physical blow.
So these explosions did not just occur in Lebanon. There were also explosions carried out in Syria. So what do we know of that?
Well, for the last few decades, Iran's entire strategy has been to set a ring of fire around Israel using their proxy organizations. And we've got Hezbollah in both Lebanon and Syria. We know Hezbollah have been operating in Syria. They were very active during the civil war there, and they gained a lot of combat experience. And then, of course, we've got the other proxies in in Iraq and in Yemen. And then we have Hamas, who are not proxies, but they're allies in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. The significance of the Syrian strike is that it shows that Israel are taking this problem as a holistic problem. They're looking at it in the round. They're not just looking at the problem posed by Hamas, the problem posed by Lebanon, the problem posed by Syria, the problem posed by Iraq. They're looking at this as one problem, and that one problem is Iran. Iran is the the center and the origin of all of this violence that we're seeing in the Middle East at the moment. And the fact that Israel struck Lebanon and Syria simultaneously, and according to some reports, including harming the Iranian ambassador to Lebanon, who had a Hezbollah pager, which tells you all you need to know about that connection. And yeah, it shows that Israel are dealing with this problem on a very much a regional scale rather than just country by country.
Yeah. So, Israel seems to be battling with Iran's axis of resistance and all fronts, right?
Yeah, that's correct. And, you can call it an axis of resistance. I would call it an axis of terror. I think this is a very clear Iranian attempt at achieving regional power in the Middle East. They're in direct opposition to Israel and Israel's Gulf allies like Saudi Arabia, UAE. If not allies, then at least fellow travelers and people who are aligned against Iran. This is what Iran is trying to achieve dominance over. And their proxy system is designed to be a terror organization to achieve that.
Correct. So let's come back to the attack. You mentioned about pagers being involved. And so many people consider it now an obsolete technology, and especially people from my generation, they've not used it, they've not even seen it, right? But Hezbollah continues to use them. So could you please elaborate on how these pagers are still being used by some terrorist organizations?
Yeah, so they're much harder traditionally to hack than the smartphone. Smartphones are so complicated that you can hack them and you can track them even when they don't have a SIM card in. Sometimes you can even track them when they're off. And the level of technological sophistication of smartphones means that there's a lot more different avenues and angles to attack that system, whereas a pager is incredibly simple. The advantage of the pager, so it was thought, is that it was therefore much harder to hack. Now, I don't think this could have happened had Israel not intercepted this batch of pagers at some point along the supply chain. They couldn't have just hacked into the pagers and made them go bang without doing something to them first. So it's a way that Israel have found to get around the simplicity of using the pager system, is to intercept the pagers at source, modify them so that they can be used as weapons, and then they've used them when they decided clearly that the time was right to do so.
Exactly. So now you mentioned about the supply chain. What's the role of Taiwanese firm Gold Apollo here? It has denied any involvement while saying that there's a Hungary-based firm called BAC, which manufactured those pagers. So do you think Taiwan is being dragged into Middle East politics here?
No, I don't think so. I think, I don't think it's a Taiwanese government angle to this at all. It's very possible that a Taiwanese company has got a manufacturing plant in Hungary. That would make perfect sense. And if you wanted to buy some pages cheap, then those kind of Asian pager firms are the sort of the market option. So I don't think there's anything underhanded or nefarious here on the Taiwanese side. I think it's very likely that the route from Hungary to Iran and then Iran to Lebanon is probably where the interception happened. But no, I don't think we can lay any blame at Taiwan's door for this at all.
That's an important point that you've raised, just mapping out the route where the intervention could have happened. So let's talk about Hezbollah now. They have vowed revenge, and Hassan Nasrallah is going to deliver an address today. So how do you think the Iran-backed group is now going to respond?
Well, we're starting to see a pattern with this, where Israel strike an Iranian or a Lebanese or a Hamas asset, and then there's an awful lot of sound and fury, but not much action. And a really good example of this was the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh back in July, when he was killed whilst visiting Tehran for the occasion of the appointments of the new president of Iran. And it was about as embarrassing as that can possibly get for Iran. That was penetration inside their own capital city on the occasion of one of their great state occasions as they appoint a new president. And yet nothing happened. There was a lot of noise and a lot of fury. Fuad Shakur was killed in Beirut the day before with an airstrike from the Israelis. He was Hezbollah's number 2. Again, a huge pattern of threats, but actually no delivery of threats. And the reason for that is because they've got nowhere really to escalate to. They've dropped nearly 10,000 rockets on Israel over the last 11 months. They tried a mass rocket attack and the Israelis intercepted it with a 100-plane airstrike where they destroyed thousands of rockets and thousands of launch sites. And Iran's army is still using 1970s technology. They're still using F-5s and their ships date back to the 1970s. So they don't actually have that many options on the table. Now, if I were to look for where they might escalate, I suspect that's probably in the West Bank, where we know they've been trying to flood that area with arms to provoke an insurrection, maybe
And we
even
have seen
a
a
third
surge of
intifada.
violence in West Bank from Israeli side as well. Raids have increased, and there have been more attacks as well.
Yeah, the Israelis are aware that Iran are trying to escalate the violence, and they've conducted preemptive strikes on a number of camps in places like Jenin. And we've seen the Israelis taking huge amounts of IEDs and seizing arms. And we've also seen an escalation in the Jordan Valley, which is Israel's eastern flank, where we know Iran are trying to push arms shipments across that border. And so, the Israelis are having to react to all these threats. But if we're looking at escalation options, that's probably the best and only realistic one for Iran right now.
Clearly, there's an asymmetrical warfare going on in that region, and West Bank, you think, would become a site of action now?
Well, that's what I would try. I think the Israelis will once again try and stop that. They'll know that these are the options. They'll be watching for an increased rocket attack from Lebanon. They'll have planes on standby. So as soon as it looks like Hezbollah are going to increase the rocket attacks, they'll have planes in the air to strike those straight away. And likewise, they know that Iran is going to try and flood arms across that border. They'll try and intercept it, and any arms shipments that reach the West Bank is something they will try and conduct raids, and as we saw last month, to try and intercept those arms shipments and prevent a third intifada being started by Iranian-backed Palestinian forces.
So, coming to Gaza now, the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is currently in Cairo to discuss about the ceasefire agreement. How do you think this incident will impact the negotiations now?
I think it sends a very clear message to Israel's opponents that they have the ability to strike them in ways they don't expect. It's noticeable that the way Hamas operate means that Israel haven't been able to do this in Gaza. I think if they could have done, they certainly would have done so by now. The fighting in Gaza is now very, very light. It's compared to how it has been. The IDF have declared that operations in Rafah are finished. They've broken the battalions' backs that are in Rafah. I spoke to President Netanyahu myself 2 weeks ago, and he said that there's only one battalion of Hamas that remains, undisrupted, and that's because they have a huge number of hostages with them. So the question for Israel is going to be how much they want the hostages back versus how much they want to dismantle Hamas, because they can't have both. The hostages are the one thing that are keeping Hamas, as a viable fighting force, because Israel are limited in what they can do to strike them. And in terms of the impact of this, I think it'll be relatively minimal in terms of Gaza. I think it's far more important when it comes to restoring deterrence at Israel's northern border with Hezbollah.
You mentioned that you spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu. So how do you think this war will proceed?
Yeah, it's very tricky. And Mr. Netanyahu was very clear that he considers finishing the job in Gaza to be the most important priority Israel has.
How long do you think that will take?
Well, I spoke to IDF soldiers and they told me 12 to 18 months to just dismantle every single tunnel they found. So it's going to be a very long time. I don't think the war will go on that long. I think the only way it goes on that long is if Israel gives up completely on the hostages, and I don't think they'll do that. So there's going to come at some point where Hamas have taken enough damage that they agree to a ceasefire deal, because let's not forget, they're the blockage at the moment. The Israelis have agreed to the plan that the Americans have put forward. And whilst Hamas's strategy is to blame Netanyahu, I don't think that's entirely fair, because we've seen no indications whatsoever that Hamas are willing to come to a ceasefire deal that's in any way fair or compromising. So I think the war will go on for a significant period of time further, until such point as Hamas realise that if they want to survive this conflict, then they're going to have to come to a ceasefire agreement and release the hostages.
All right. Okay, my last question for you is, you mentioned the United States. So if Kamala Harris comes to power in America, I don't think Israel will get as much elbow room to do what it's doing currently, to carry out such attacks. So do you think it's working against the 5 November deadline here?
I'm not sure, because political rhetoric and military action have not really lined up during this conflict, whilst there's been some pretty stiff condemnation from Washington. Nevertheless, the United States military in the Middle East has been firmly on Israel's side. We've seen a number of aircraft carriers pushed into the region to make sure Iran don't escalate too much. We've seen airstrikes, shooting down of Iranian missiles back in April when Iran tried to fire 500 missiles at Israel. So at a military level, we've seen a pretty consistent approach from the Americans, and there's been very, very few signs of a reduction in arms sales, which is incredibly lucrative for the Americans. And I think, if anything, if Kamala Harris comes to power, actually, I think that takes pressure off her. At the moment, the White House is having to balance the needs for security in the Middle East with the need to win the election in November. Yeah, I think she'll have more freedom to support Israel once that's over. Quite frankly, I think America knows how powerful Israel is as an ally in the Middle East. They know how useful it is to have a friendly democracy as the only democracy in the region. And I think they can see that the strategic benefit of supporting Israel outweighs any strategic, failings there might be.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for speaking to us and outlining how this attack will impact West Asia at large and what will be the repercussions for, of course, the negotiations going on in the Gaza war. Thank you.
Thank you very much.